Okay, I'll just let you bring that down a bit. And hello everyone. Lovely to see so many people here on a cold winter's night. But I'm not surprised. We've got a great speaker and a local speaker from Holyhead. Holyhead's proudest literary product, and with an astonishing number of books, of which this is a mere selection. So I very much hope people will be buying some of those at the end. David Crystal, OBE. Has been writing in Holyhead for how many years?
We came back in 1984 from down south.
Yeah, since '84, and lots of university appointments, and now an honorary professor of linguistics at Bangor. And as I say, over 100 books on language. We've never actually met before, but we've met sort of virtually, as it were, because at the World Service we often consult or interview David Crystal on linguistic matters, so we've done a few interviews over the years, but never in person. And you were a very early adopter of technology, which meant we could hear you very clearly.
Oh yeah, we got a studio at home.
It was very, yes, you're ahead of the game in terms of having the technology which enabled you to be heard around the world. And we're going to hear your talk about one of your books, Language Death, is your theme for the evening, and so we're very much looking forward to hearing from you.
Yeah, well, thanks, Owen, and good evening, everybody. Noswaith dda, chi gyd. It's lovely to be here. Last time I was in Rosniger, some years ago now, it was part of the Save the Library campaign. You remember that? Yeah, that was quite a moment. And yes, tremendous. No, it's great to be here. You know, we don't normally come this far south. You know, it's I hear there are dragons around here. You know, it's a bit risky. But yes, I'm in Holyhead now. Have been since the 1980s. I was brought up there originally, and then left in the teenage years. And I'll tell you the reason. That's irrelevant to the talk, as you'll hear in a little while. And worked down south, mainly at the University of Reading. And then came back in the 80s and been here ever since with wife Hilary and business partner over there, who'll be looking after the bookstall. This is Black Thursday. You'll read dramatic reductions in prices today. Don't tell the publisher; they won't like that. So yes, this was your idea originally, or at least somebody said. Let's have a talk in which we talk a little bit about the status of Welsh and how it's doing. And there's only one way to talk about that, and that is to link it to the overall theme of endangered languages, what's happening to them, what's going on in the world at the moment. And I'm going to begin with a bit of gloom. It gets better, I promise, but a bit of gloom. On the 25th of September this year, 6-7 weeks ago, in Brazil, Mindanao, a gentleman called Aura, A-U-R-A, Aura, died, aged 77. He was the last speaker of his language. His wife previously also spoke the language, but she died a couple of years previously. Nobody knows his surname. They didn't know what to call him, so they called him the name of the language. So they called him Aura, which is the language name. The last speaker. The language had never been written down, so nobody knows how it was. There are a few lists of words that somebody collected, but nothing more seriously than that. Now, Aura is the most recent example of a language death. Because when the last speaker dies, it goes. One day it's there, next day it's gone. But there's somebody like Aura dying every 3 months on average. 3 months. There's a last speaker disappearing somewhere in the world. There's an organization called the Foundation for Endangered Languages, and they have a magazine that comes out. You can find them online, fel.com or whatever it is. And they do a newsletter. In the newsletter, there is an obituary. And every few months, there's a report of some last speaker dying somewhere or other. And when you think of it now, you know, every 3 months or so, then how does that add up to all the languages in the world? So, big question, how many languages are there in the world? Well, of course, it all depends what you mean by a language. You see, the difference between a language and a dialect is sometimes quite slippery. Dialects are everywhere, but how many of them become real languages? I mean, the difference really is, isn't it, that if you understand somebody else, more or less, they're speaking a different dialect of your language. If you don't understand them at all, then it's a different language. But it isn't as simple as that. Take, for example, the languages of Scandinavia. Danish, Norwegian, Swedish. They're all mutually intelligible. A Norwegian can understand a Swede pretty well, and a Swede a Dane pretty well, not so easily, but still. They're all sort of dialects of a kind of Scandinavian culture, but if you're in Norway, you speak Norwegian, you don't speak Swedish, and if you're in Sweden, and so on, you see. It's a political decision as much as anything else, what counts as a language. Same thing happened in Yugoslavia, in former Yugoslavia, where the people of Croatia and Serbia and Montenegro and a few other places down there, they all spoke one language called Serbo-Croatian. And then Yugoslavia broke up into the different countries. What do they speak now? They speak Croatian in Croatia, they speak Serbian in Serbia, and so on. And don't you dare suggest that you speak Serbian in Croatia. You'd get into really serious trouble. So this happens quite a lot. You're not quite sure how many languages there are because of this uncertainty. And it happens near at home as well. Go up across the border and what do you find up there? Well, you find Scots. Scots, the language of Robbie Burns. And it's a dialect of English. Don't you say that in north of the border. They say, no, Scots is a different language. And they'd fight you for it if you denied it. So there are always these issues. So when you take it all into account, you can never be certain about how many languages there are in the world. And the other thing is that every now and then a new one gets discovered. You may have read the other day about, also in Brazil, some little group that hadn't been contacted before were finally contacted, and it seems they spoke a language that nobody knew anything about. So that's, +1. But if you take all the statistics into account, the figure is somewhere between 6,000 and 7,000 languages around the world. You can look them up if you want. There's a lovely website called Ethnologue, and that collects them all. It's the biggest site of its kind. And if you go in there, you'll see all the languages that are still alive, plus a fair number of extinct ones, such as Aura, which just died out. I looked them up just today and they're on the ball. Aura is now extinct, it says. 3 months ago, Aura was still alive. It's that sort of dramatic, sudden difference. So something like 6,000 languages or so. And there's a language dying out every 3 months on average. Do the maths. It means that in this century, 3,000 languages will disappear. Half the languages of the world will go, unless something happens. I'll tell you about that in a minute. But that's the prediction. And that kind of loss is unprecedented. I mean, we all know about the loss of plants and animals and things like that. Well, if you go to the websites on ecology and ask what percentage of animals and insects and so on are becoming so endangered they're going to die out, and the answer is, well, it varies, of course, depending upon the species, but 2%, 3%, 5%. It's that sort of level. Languages, 50%. And that's the dramatic difference. Now, why are they dying out? Well, there are a whole raft of reasons, as you can imagine. Sometimes a language disappears because the community disappears. This happens quite a lot in parts of the world where there are coastal communities subject to ravages such as typhoons and tsunamis and all that sort of thing. You read about it every now and again. A coastal village in Sumatra, say, or somewhere like that. Tsunami comes in, destroys the community on the coast. And everybody is so sad about the loss of life and the loss of culture and so on, but it rarely gets mentioned that probably also there was the loss of a language at that time too. Because in so many parts of the world, the languages differ every few miles. That's the thing. It's not like Europe, where a language spreads over quite a considerable period. You can go, 25 miles down the road in some of these places, it's different language there. It's a bit like that with dialects in this country, isn't it? Or different accents. You just go 25 miles, well, you don't even go 25 miles, go as far as Holyhead, yeah? And you get a different speech there, yeah? Go to Bangor, aye? And it's different there in Bangor, aye? Yeah, in Holyhead, aye, in Bangor. Oh well, there we go. That sort of thing. Dialects and accents change quite quickly in Britain, but it's languages that change so quickly in other parts of the world. We're not used to it over here. Not used to that kind of language spread. We're not used to the fact that the majority of the world's speakers are bilingual. 3/4 of the world's population is naturally bilingual. Something like half are naturally trilingual. Over here, if you've got one language, you're lucky, you think. Well, that's it. Here in Wales, we've got two. But most people in England used to be totally monolingual. It's changing now, of course, with multiculturalism coming in. But we're the exception in this part of Europe. Go to Africa, perfectly normal to have a community where people speak 5 languages. Perfectly normal. Not all the time for everything, of course. One language for the home, another language for the shops, another language for church, maybe, another language for the radio, that sort of thing. And you don't translate between them, I have one language for that, another language for that. I've got a language for tomatoes and vegetables and things in this language. But I can't translate it into the other languages because they don't have words for tomatoes and things. It's that sort of fluid situation. 4 or 5 languages, no big deal. I discovered this. Even I get surprised sometimes. I have a grandson who is now just learned to drive, heaven help us. But when he was 3, he was the son of, my daughter, obviously. Therefore he has English. And a Venezuelan Spanish speaker, so he has Spanish. And he is living in Amsterdam, so he has Dutch. And these days he's fluent in, Dutch and English. He doesn't use Spanish so much now. But he was 3, and he came over one day on a holiday here. And we went to Triada Bay, and there was somebody with a lovely multicolored bike. And he looks at me and says, "Fiets," which is the Dutch word for bike, but I didn't know. So I said, "What?" And he looked at me and thought, And then he said, "Bicicleta," the Spanish word for bike. And I went, "What?" And he looked at me and his face fell and he said, "Bike." This is my 3rd shot. If you can't do this one, I'm getting a new grandpa. Age 3, what? Perfectly normal. Perfectly normal. So, first reason that languages die out, the community disappears. Second reason, not very common, but used to be more common, genocide. Linguistic genocide. Linguicide, as it's sometimes called. In other words, the language is banned. You're not allowed to use it for whatever political reason. In Franco, there are some lovely languages in Spain, for instance, Galician and, all sorts, Weren't allowed to use them in Franco's time. and you'd be in serious trouble if you tried. And those with a long memory will perhaps remember the same thing happening here in Wales. The famous Welsh knot, N-O-T, famous Welsh knot. Very common in the 19th century and into the 20th. If you were heard speaking Welsh in your primary school, you were given a board which you put round your neck, and that was a great source of shame, and you desperately tried to find some other kid who would speak Welsh, and if you found that kid, you'd pass the board over to him or her. And so it would go all the way round, and the last person in the day to have that board got beaten up. The Welsh knot. Then there are similar cases in many other languages. So, linguicide, we don't want that language. For whatever political or other reason, we don't want it and we'll stop it. But these two reasons together don't amount to the main reason, which is cultural development. The need for a better life linked with a change in language. So, for instance, you're in Australia, where there were something like 500 Aboriginal languages once upon a time, and now there are about 10 left. And everybody speaks English now. Why? Well, colonialism, obviously. But why did they bother to switch languages? Because it was a way to access power, to access a better job, to whatever the reason might be. English, in this case, was the killer language for Aboriginal languages. Same point applies to the United States and Canada, where the Indian languages there were decimated. There must be, of the couple of thousand Indian languages there were once upon a time, there must be perhaps just a few hundred left now, 200 or 300 maybe, difficult to say. And only a handful, a couple of dozen, are really very, very widely spoken. And again, English comes in, they're the conquerors, they're the people with the power, and so eventually you decide that you're going to adopt that language. And you get the 3 stages of deterioration. The first stage, where you learn the language because you need a better quality of life for your family. You're not very good at the language, you do the best you can, but still you become a sort of bilingual, sort of. And then you think to yourself, my kids, I want them to have a better life than me, so I'm going to use this powerful language to my kids. And you do. And the kids grow up speaking excellent English, along with their mother tongue, which they feel a bit ashamed of. And so they become English dominant, that second generation. And then they have kids. And those kids now have forgotten the ancestral language. They speak only English now, those new kids. And that's the end of the story, except it isn't. Because there's a 4th generation. And that 4th generation, remember, we're now talking about a family that has got a good quality of life now because of they've adopted English and become part of the powerful community. They've got television sets and all the other things that you need. And they're thinking to themselves, hey, you know, life is quite good, really. But hang on a minute, who are we? Who are we? What is our culture? Dad, what's our culture? Oh, well, Grandpa used to have another language, you know, and why can't we have that language? Oh, because, you know, Grandpa lost it, really, we never used it very much. Why can't we have our language back? And this 4th generation movement is quite dramatic in some parts of the world and quite successful in some parts of the world, which is why I said at the beginning, I start with gloom, but it's going to get better. Now, I mentioned English as the killer language, but it's not the only one. All the languages of Brazil, for instance, and South America generally, and Central America, they've largely disappeared. Why? Not because of English, but because of Spanish and Portuguese. And then you go to Africa, to Middle and towards the south of Africa, and you hear everybody using Swahili, which has killed some of the local languages of that part of the world, because that is the powerful language for that area. Go to China, and lots of the local languages of China have disappeared, partly for political reasons, but partly because Chinese, Mandarin in particular, is the authorized version for that part of the world. Go to Russia, and many of the indigenous languages of Russia have disappeared because of Russian. So you see my point. It's any powerful language is likely to displace a minority language. And will only stop if people appreciate the importance of individual languages, which is what UNESCO is now doing and has been doing for some decades now. The UNESCO Intangible Heritage dimension, the branch of UNESCO that deals with intangible heritage, all sorts of cultural issues like dance and you know, storytelling and things like that. But language is one of the dominant things there. And UNESCO has for some time now been stressing the importance of two things: language documentation and language revitalization. What's the difference? Well, I told you at the beginning that language that Aura spoke has disappeared because it was never written down. That's what documentation is. Write the language down. Or these days, of course, record it on your phone or whatever you've got. And then, once it's written down, and that means, of course, interviewing the people who speak this language. I've done this many a time. And writing a dictionary, writing a grammar, writing a pronunciation manual, writing a style guide, writing down the stories, all the ancestral stories, getting it all down there so that it can be taught in a school. Or, in some cases, and I example now a language called Kaurna, K-A-U-R-N-A, which is an Aboriginal language of Australia, died out in the late 19th century, but it was written down. And so now you can go to a primary school in that part of Australia and learn Kaurna once again, because the grammar and the dictionary and so on was there. Of course, it will have changed, you know, there'll be new words coming in for the internet and things like that, but the basic language is there. It's the sort of thing that happens everywhere. Some very successful, some not successful. Let's switch now to the Celtic languages, because that's one of the things you asked me to talk about this evening. How is Welsh doing? Welsh is the successful story in the Celtic languages. Welsh is held up as an iconic example of success in all parts of the world. Remember those 7,000 languages? All the statistics from the ones spoken by multi-millions down to ones spoken by just 10 people or 20 people. Where is Welsh in that? Welsh is in the top 8%. The top 8% of spoken language in the world, of the numbers of speakers of languages in the world. What are the number of speakers? I can never remember my statistics. Here we go. The Welsh census 2021. 583,300 speakers in Wales. That's 17%, just over 17% of the people in Wales speak Welsh. Anglesey is doing very well. Anglesey had 55% of the population. It's only, what, 70,000 people in Anglesey? Anglesey is doing very well. The census showed that that figure was a bit of a drop compared with the previous census 10 years before. But it's still pretty good, and it's enough. That figure of 500,000 is enough to put Welsh into that top 8% of speakers of languages in the world. Why? Well, you know the reasons probably. The activism that took place in the 60s and 70s, the Welsh television channel, S4C, S4C, a whole range of things that happened that proved to be extremely successful. It was bottom-up interest by the part of the people. That's the crucial thing. To save a language, you need three things. You need to have the community wanting it to be saved. That's the thing. And you might think that's a given, but no, actually, in some parts of the world, they're not bothered, which is one of the reasons why it dies so quickly. But here, there was a huge movement wanting it to be saved. Secondly, there needs to be cash. It's expensive saving a language. You know, think about it. What have you got to do to save a language? You've got to get it taught in schools. Okay, fine. That means you've got to train the teachers. Okay, fine. But then you need the textbooks. Okay, fine. And then you need respect for the learners. Where do you get respect? From the media. Hence the television channel. So important in giving the language that level of upness before. And then bottom up needs to be reflected by top down. The third thing, government has to believe in it. And the Welsh government took its time, but eventually there were 2 language acts that protect Welsh and make it now, as you know, a co-official language in the Principality. And that took quite a lot of doing in its time. And there are moves afoot for yet more protection of one kind and another. And you probably have heard of the plans of the Welsh Language Committee to double the number of Welsh speakers by 2050 to be 1 million. I wonder, will they get there? But anyway, the plans are there. That's the thing. And it's top-down interest. Some cash. So all 3 things together, bottom-up, cash and top-down. And our language is doing very well as a consequence. By contrast with the other Celtic languages, you see. What are they? Well, the languages that are most closely related to Welsh are Cornish and Breton. Cornish is beginning to get its act together, but after a long, long period of time. The last native speaker of Cornish died out in the 18th century, and then it became moribund. But the language had been well recorded. And so when the new Sons and Daughters of Cornwall movement began a few decades ago, there was stuff there. It's not easy, it's a bit controversial, because nobody quite knows how to pronounce a lot of it. So you get people at one end of Cornwall is a big county. If you've ever driven down it, you know. At one end, they sort of pronounce it one way. At the other end, they pronounce it a different way. There are some lovely rows in Cornwall about what the correct pronunciation is. A bit like North Wales and South Wales, but worse, you know. So Cornish is coming back, and you'll see it on road signs now and things like that. Breton, one of my daughters lives in Brittany, so we've been over there a few times. You never see Breton anywhere these days. There was a television channel, came along, TV Brej it was called, but it was very late. And there's a strong movement, but it's not that strong. And it doesn't have the top-down interest because France, French, not that keen on Breton and other minority languages of France. There's a sort of, the French are still a bit upset by the fact that they're no longer the international language of the world that they used to be, and this, what's it called? English has taken over. How dare they? So there's a sort of, we must keep French alive and well. The francophonie, the francophone group of countries, Africa especially, of course. So they're not so keen on minority languages, and as a result, Breton isn't doing so well at all. And then there's the other branch of the Celtic family, Irish Gaelic, Manx in the Isle of Man, and Scottish Gaelic. And each of these has got into serious trouble. A number of speakers of Scottish Gaelic, for example, are just a few tens of thousands. Strong movement up there, very popular in some parts of Scotland, and increasing presence on on the radio and television and the internet. I'll come onto the internet in just a minute. And that's one of the problems in Scotland. You see, in Wales, it's pretty straightforward. There's English and there's Welsh. So if there's controversy or issues, it's a fairly straightforward situation. Not so in Scotland, because remember I told you there is Scottish English, Scots sort of dialect that you hear all over the place. There's Robbie Burns Scots, which is a language, remember, and then there's Gaelic. So there are 3 languages up there now. And sometimes they don't like each other very much. So the poor old Scottish Parliament has a bit of a problem trying to decide how to keep this balance between the 3 and what to do with the limited funding. You know, give them some money, they want some money. You know, that sort of issue. Quite controversial. Irish Gaelic has begun to boom after a long period of silence. There they didn't do what Wales did. They should have had a television channel early on, and they didn't. The radio started to take off, and they're catching up. And in schools, we were over there, Hilary and I, a little while ago, judging a Gaelic schools competition. And the kids were tremendous, absolutely fantastic, and their parents too, but the kids were speaking Gaelic better than the parents. That's the thing. And when you haven't got a home background to support, and you're just reliant on a few hours in school, you see the problem. And the problem in any case is one that in my world is called intergenerational transmission. What does that mean? Well, intergeneration, between the generations, transmission. In other words, the kids transmit the language, not the adults. The adults teach the kids. The kids, the teenagers in particular, are the parents of the next generation. If the teenagers go off the boil, as teenagers do generally, then the language is in trouble. A language can disappear in one generation, you see, if the teenagers don't go for it. So the ultimate question is, how on earth do you keep the teenagers happy with a language which is not cool? English is cool because of all the Beatles and, oh, sorry, my generation, you know, all the things that they go into these days. Welsh, not so cool, no? Irish, not so cool, no? Well, a lot of people are doing something to change that. Some of the Welsh pop groups now sing in Welsh very successfully. And of course, along has come the internet. Now, what's the role of the internet? Good news or bad news? Both. For the first time, an endangered language can achieve a world audience because of the internet. Imagine you're a speaker of an endangered language 30 years ago. How do you get your language in front of everybody around the world, or even in your country? In the newspaper? Not a chance. Local radio? No, they're not interested. Television? Well, maybe, but not very often anyway. Now, as long as you're wired, then you can have your language in front of everybody, so long as you've got a mobile phone or something like that. And in parts of Africa now, there's the hill outside the village, and at the top of the hill is a new transmission station, and that's where the villagers all go now to have a social occasion. They go to the transmission station because that's where their local language is based, and they can tune into it whenever they like. And in some cases the kids tune in as well because they're the generation with the phones and everything. It is largely mobile phone dominated in places like Africa and so on, because so many parts of Africa are still not wired. You know, I went to a community centre in, where was it? In the north part of South Africa. And there was just one big container, you know, these container ship things, one of those huge containers. It was the only place in town where there was a computer connection. And you go into it, and there were 20 computers all around the wall. And the place was packed with people wanting to get online. It was the only place in town where you could get online. So computers are not the solution in many parts of the world, but mobile phones are. And so the good news is that you can get your endangered language in front of everybody in a way that you couldn't before. And there are now online language communities, some extremely successful, especially in a language which is spread over a wide area. I'm thinking of a language like Navajo, for instance. You all know about the Navajo Indians. Well, Navajo as a language is now a hugely successful internet site in the United States, and people speak it from all over the place. Here in Wales, go online, you'll find all sorts of things now in Welsh, blogs and TikTok things. I've never ticked or talked personally, but a lot of people do, and there's some Welsh stuff there. Instagram reels, where Welsh is perfectly normal. And the pop groups are out there as well, too. So there is a certain cachet now in the teenage world, which wasn't there before, and that's a very, very promising sign. At the same time, English is out there. English is the dominant language of the internet. Still, 80% of all internet traffic is in English. Other languages, of course, very important as well. But there's competition out there between these languages also. So what can you and I do, you know, when we're talking about endangered languages? Well, the first thing, of course, is to be aware. And one is aware by going to a site like the Foundation for Endangered Languages and just getting its newsletter or just keeping in touch with what's going on there. They talk about all the things that are happening, positive as well as the negative ones, the obituaries that I mentioned. Or you can buy a book, if you found one, on language death, for example. There are some, I believe, about the place. You know, there's quite a lot of literature out there now, that's my point. Google language death or endangered languages, you'll get a raft of stuff which is available. But personally, what can you do? Assuming you want to, that's the thing. Some people do, some people don't. Well, one of the things that's proved to be most successful, and this is a UNESCO recommendation, is you bring in the arts to support the local language. The arts in the broadest sense of the word. Novels, poems, plays, music, ballet, sculpture, painting, everything. And you use, and people may not be interested in language so much, but they love the arts. Everybody loves some sort of arts. People say, you know, the arts is elitist, but you go into their house and there's some pictures on the wall. You know, they've got something. And the question is, that was raised back in the 1980s now, is how are the arts doing in relation to language? Where can you find a novel about endangered languages, or a poem, or a play? Where can you see a sculpture devoted to endangered languages? Where can you see paintings, and so on? A ballet, a symphony? And the answer was at the time, none anywhere, or hardly any. I'm not talking about somebody writing a poem about Welsh, or writing a poem about Scots, or writing a poem about Navajo or something. That's quite common. No, writing a poem about the endangered languages' plight in the world. And that's unusual, or at least it was then, but it's not so unusual now. There are now stories about endangered languages, fictional stories, I mean. There are the occasional play. I wrote one once, some 20 or so years ago. You can read it online if you want at my website. And artists generally, I've now seen an endangered language exhibition in Spain, which was not just about Spanish or the languages of Spain, but about languages generally. And UNESCO generally is doing a great deal under the heading of intangible heritage to try and bring the arts into the foreground. So on the whole, I find the situation really rather promising. It's too late to do much for those 3,000 languages that are going to disappear, but there are a good couple of thousand languages that could go one way or the other, depending upon how much they're documented, depending upon how much the community wants the language to survive. And why would you want your language to survive? Because it is your vision. That is the thing about a language. It is a vision of the world, a unique vision of the world. No other language gives you a vision of what it means to be human like your language. The evidence is try translating. You know the story. You've all learnt some language somewhere or other, and you all know that try to translate everything from one language into English or vice versa can be quite difficult at times. You know, the French have a word for it, sort of thing. The Welsh have a word for it. Hiraeth. Hiraeth. Translate that into English. Not possible. You can have a go and say it's something to do with longing and missing your country and so on. But there's nothing quite like it in English. And there are many other words in Welsh, and of course words in English that don't translate the other way. So it's the vision that we're trying to keep alive. Not just the language, it's the vision of the culture, of what it means to be human. And one last thought. What's the biggest danger facing an endangered language? You might think it's the 3 points I've mentioned earlier. The disasters, the genocide, and the English dominance, for example, in our case. No, there's a bigger danger than that. These are all dangers from the outside. A bigger danger comes from within. Comes from within. What do I mean by that? Here's a story. One of those Welsh pop groups very early on sang in Welsh, gave their Welsh song a title. This is my truth, tell me yours, in Welsh. It was criticised by a professor of Welsh in Cardiff for wrong Welsh, bad Welsh, too colloquial, not got it right, the grammar's wrong there, correct it. And that's the problem. So you're now wanting Welsh to be part of the young person's world, and you do this and do the best you, and now some elder of the community comes along and says, no, you shouldn't speak Welsh like that. No, you need to speak Welsh like I do. That's the problem. It's not a problem in English. In English, there are all sorts of varieties of English. Older people's English, young people's English, American English, British English. There are 60 or 70 dialects of English around the world. English can cope with all of that. Can cope with it. Older people may not like the younger people's language, and the younger people may not like the older person's language. But if you go to a school these days and do an A-level English language, for example, you'll be taught about these different varieties and how it's good to have, as it were, a wardrobe, a linguistic wardrobe in your head of all these varieties that you can switch. You're more powerful if you can switch. I can speak like you, I can speak like you, and I respect both. Unfortunately, there's a lot of the opposite in Wales, and many elders are totally dismissive of young persons' Welsh, especially when they bring English words into their Welsh, and it becomes a sort of Wenglish. Well, damn it, it's Wenglish, not English, it is Welsh English. And if that's the language that they are proud of and want to use, then what's the opposite? Don't use it, okay, the language is gone then completely anyway. Or use it, but don't forget there's my kind of Welsh as well. There's the Welsh of the Bible, and there's the Welsh of this and that and the other. So if we respect you, why don't you respect us? And that kind of philosophy is, I'm glad to say, slowly growing. But there was a time when the biggest danger to Welsh, in my mind, actually came from Welsh speakers themselves. And by the way, that's not unique to Wales. Happens all over the world. So there we are. You said talk for 45 minutes. Look, done knee. 45 minutes.
Not bad. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for an incredibly articulate 45 minutes with barely a note.
And 15 seconds.
Yes, absolutely. I'm sorry about that.
Let me just, before we open it up, just push back and ask you this. You know, in the 60s and 70s, there was an idea that world peace and harmony and maybe the distribution of wealth could be improved if everyone spoke Esperanto.
Oh, yes.
Not a colonial language, a grammatically sensible language, and that it would have overcome a lot of the divisions and tensions in our world created by cultural difference, but sometimes expressed by linguistic difference. So first of all, Esperanto. And secondly, can I just ask you this? You talk about language expressing a vision of the world. If you take Cornish, which has not existed, you're saying, as a living language for a couple hundred years or something, I mean, there's no way that it's going to be revived in any sense which a Cornishman or woman 200 years ago would understand. So those unique words you're talking about that carry a certain meaning that are not translatable they've gone. I mean, the new Cornish culture will be a fake culture. It won't be a proper Cornish culture as was 200 years ago. It'll be something that they've imagined today. It will again create tensions and difficulties, which it already is in Cornwall. The Cornish speakers demanding resources off English speakers, you know. So is that a sensible project to recreate a fake culture which doesn't really reflect the original Cornish culture?
Well, I wouldn't call it fake. I'd just say it's different. And the difference is going to be probably not much greater than the difference between, say, modern English and Shakespeare's English, or go further back to Chaucer's English, or further back still to Anglo-Saxon, which, if you read it, is unintelligible to modern English ears. So, you know, cultures change, times change, language changes to reflect that culture. And it's not entirely, I mean, you know, when I last spoke to a group down there, there's quite a Cornish literature, you know, and they are keen on keeping that literature alive. And so, you know, they use it, Cornish Bible, for example, and things like this. How much of it is actually going to influence the present day Cornish is up for grabs, don't know. But I wouldn't say there was as big a divide between the modern and the old as you're hinting at. I think there is a greater continuity there. They would certainly argue that the continuity, the more extreme Cornish people say, the language never died, you know. It never died out. It was still being used by my grandfather. Oh, really? Oh, well.
Is that not true?
Who knows? Who knows? But, you know, they are, let's put it this way, they are aware of the importance of the tradition and are trying to identify with it as best they can. But how successful they're going to be, I don't know. I don't know. But on the Esperanto thing, Esperanto is so interesting. It was one of a number of artificial languages that were created at the end of the 19th century. About 30 of them altogether, artificial languages. Volapük, and another one, and many others. Esperanto was the only successful one to last, thanks to same sort of issue, you know, enthusiasts, a time, remember, where the League of Nations was being introduced. There was this concern for internationalism, and Esperanto seemed to fill a need, and so it's picked up. And for a while was spoken by, nobody knows exactly how many. It's still going well, by the way. The Esperanto Association has something like 15 million speakers around the world. But now, speakers, they speak it in China, in a Chinese accent. they speak it in Romania with a Romanian accent. Can you understand each other? Can you heck? It's very difficult. The Esperantist organization still exists then, and they have an annual conference. I went to it once. And by Jove, you know, Bible thumpers are nothing compared with Esperantists. They're just so enthusiastic. But the problem is, you see, is one of intergenerational transmission. Are you going to teach it to your kids? And the kids are interested really only in English, etc., like I was saying before. You've got to have a really keen family situation to say, my kid is going to grow up with Esperanto as a first language, and therefore not be able to speak to anybody else in the world except a few million here and there, you know. Big problem, big problem. The other thing that happened was that it fell out of favor. Esperanto was developed by a Polish gentleman called Zamenhof. We've been to his hometown. There is a Zamenhof street, and his statue is at both ends of it. They're so proud of him, and rightly so. But it was Poland in the Cold War, beyond the curtain. The Americans didn't like that one bit. And so what happened was that Esperanto was banned in the United States because of its political associations. And for a long time, there was that resonance of banning all, you know, lots of places said, well, I can't do Esperanto. No, I mean, it's all communists. That kind of attitude you see right into the 60s and 70s, and it was a sign of death, really, for Esperanto. I'm amazed that it's managed to survive that period into modern times. So, yeah, it's still there, not as strong as it ever was. It's doing well on the internet and things like that. There's an internet channel, there's an Instagram internet Esperanto channel and things like that. But does language guarantee peace? Does a universal language guarantee peace? If this is a point sometimes made, isn't it? Or people say, if everybody in the world spoke English, we'd have a totally peaceful world because we'd all understand each other. Right? English has never stopped war. There's been a civil war in England. There was a civil war in America. The only country in the world, as far as I know, that there's never been a civil war is one of the most multicultural, multilinguistic countries on earth, namely Switzerland. 4 official languages in Switzerland. Civil war? No. But here, yes. So, you know, a universal global language doesn't stop people wanting to hit each other if they're going to do so.
Thank you very much. Mark, you got a question?
So yeah, I thought that was a fantastic talk. Thank you very much, David.
Thank you.
Really enjoyed it. I'm a biologist, and you hit on a couple of the things that were triggering when I was thinking about what you were going to talk about. And the first was human evolution and the evolution of languages alongside those. And you talked about language death, but I was very interested in language creation as humans sort of travelled across the earth, and I was wondering what you had thoughts were on that. And the other one was that my specificity as a biologist was as neurobiologist, and I'm very interested in the idea that the type of language you speak actually affects the way you think.
Oh.
So I'm wondering whether you could talk about that.
Well, 2 points. Yes, of course it affects how you think. There are 2 forces that affect the way you use language. One is your culture, and the other is indeed the whole thought processing situation, which is affected by the language. You think in a certain way. What you mustn't do is go to extremes and say, because I'm a first language speaker of French, therefore I think in a French way, and you're a first language speaker of English, therefore you think in an English way, therefore we can never understand each other. If you quantify the amount of a language that is actually reflecting your thought and influencing your thought, like Hiraeth and things like that. I actually supervised a project some years ago about this. We got French dictionary, English dictionary, and also German and English and others. Oh, so you compare all the words in a French dictionary compared with all the words in an English dictionary of the same size. How many of them are exact translations? And how many of them are reflecting, being French versus being English? And the answer for French was about 10% only. 10%.
10% directly translate.
Untranslatable.
Okay.
10% untranslatable.
Okay.
Or translatable with difficulty, that sort of thing. Because of the way, you're being French or whatever it is. Now that 10% is for French and English. We did the same thing for a couple of other languages. In Europe, the figures were pretty similar. Did the same thing for Chinese, and it was nearer 50%. So, do I understand a Chinese person? Well, if that Chinese person is speaking English, you're getting by, but only possibly 50% of the time are you going to get an exact understanding between the two cultures. So these figures are going to vary enormously. But translation exists as a reality. So we get on. Interpreting exists as a reality. Difference, translation for writing, interpreting for speech. And for the most part, we survive quite well until there's a breakdown and some problem happens and you've misunderstood me. This happens a lot at the United Nations. And I know many of the translators at the United Nations. They tear their hair out sometimes at the local idioms that a language, a minister uses. And what on earth is the equivalent of that in English? They've no idea, and they do the best they can. But I remember somebody saying to me once, going the other way around, the British minister said, that will eat your heart out. And the poor translator into, I forget what language it was now, French or something, said, how on earth do I translate eat your heart out into French? That kind of thing, the idioms of the language. Great. So that's part two. Hang on, I haven't talked about part one yet.
No, don't worry. We're just getting the microphone ready to go a keen flow.
Yeah, but part one, about the evolution. When did human language evolve? Well, short answer, nobody knows. The guesses are somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 years ago. Somewhere between that. Probably nearer 100,000. Written language, of course, goes back very recently, only to 6,000 or 7,000 years BC. Spoken language, well, now we're back on that question. What does it mean to speak a language? What sort of thing would it have been? Would it have been a sign language, for example? We haven't talked about sign languages this evening. Could it have been a sign language? Could it have been some sort of musical grunting notation? They're all counting as a language, but not anything like we know today. So depending on what you mean by early language, that date will vary enormously. But on the whole, most books, if you read on this subject, will say something like 100,000 years ago, languages of the world started to develop. In one place, like the Bible says, and then Babel messed it all up? No. There's the myth of Babel. Babel is in Genesis chapter 11. God said, they're getting all proud, these people, we're going to mess the languages up, so they won't understand each other. So there was one language before that? Nah. Because you read Genesis chapter 10, it refers to the children of Noah speaking different languages. Before Babel. There were already languages in the world. But the how they developed, when they developed, did they all develop? The language families of the world seem to have developed more or less independently in different places at different times. You can't just relate all the languages to one original language easily. People try. You know, people spend their lifetimes trying to do this. If you want the latest book on that subject, there's a lovely book that came out this year called Proto, P-R-O-T-O, which is the history of the Indo-European language family, which is what we speak. And even within Indo-European, there were all sorts of spontaneous developments here and there and everywhere. Not one single clear original source. Okay, over to you.
Shall I go?
David, hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
David, fascinating stuff. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Interdenominational...
Bit closer.
It's a bit closer, right,
Yeah.
okay. You've probably read in the press recently, children a bit older than your grandson, 3-year-old grandson, have been communicating, using the phrase 6, 7.
6, 7, yes.
With a few finger movements on the 7. Is this starting to end language as we know it, or what do you think?
No, it's the latest fashion, isn't it? I was asked the other day to go on the Jeremy Vine programme to talk about 6, 7, and I had no idea what he was talking about. I had to look it up. And it's the latest fashion. Here's a statistic for you. There was a study done of the slang of young people's language in the 1970s by an American guy. And he published a dictionary on it. 75% of the words that were popular in the 1970s are no longer used by anybody. Young people left them behind. They left them behind, why? Because older people started to use them. And when that happens, they are not cool anymore. Bling is an example. Bling, you know, it was Caribbean slang for, you know, jewellery and things like that, and all the ornate stuff that you can wear. That's bling. That's bling, man. I got my bling on, yeah. And then that was a teenage thing. And then the adults started to use it. And it travelled. And people started to talk, you know, hello, I've got some bling. Really? Oh, yes, I like your bling. At that point, no young person is going to use that word anymore. I give 6, 7, 5 years, maybe more. But you know, that's the thing. Slang dies out. The chief use of slang is to say that you're one of the gang. And the gang varies quickly from one period to the next. The internet is speeding up that process of words becoming uncool very, very quickly. As soon as it spreads beyond TikTok or YouTube or whatever it is, the channel is you're using, as soon as it spreads, people stop using it. It comes so quickly. It's invented in no time. When chat groups started on the internet, this was a time when I was studying it a great deal. Not one of my books, it's not here this evening, called Language and the Internet. And I studied the language of the internet, and what I found was new dialects of internet language were being invented, roughly one a week, because a chat group meets together. So all these people are in the chat room, and it's on some subject or other, or it might be a global one, you know, a French group or whatever it might be. And you're using English. Within a few hours, some local usages will develop on that chat room, in that chat room, that no other chat room will have, because they want to identify with it. So it becomes cool to invent new words and new slang. I'll give you just one example. One of the chat rooms I studied, remember you're typing all the time, they typed the word computer, only they typed it comptour at the end, comptour. It was a mistake. Oh, they thought this was wonderful. So everybody now spells on that chat room comptour. They don't spell computer. And when a newbie, a new person, came to that chat room and spelled computer, he was condemned for spelling it wrong. Because he should spell comptour on our chat room. Now, these dialects come and go. 6, 7 will come and go. How long it'll take, anybody's guess. But it's not something to be worried about. If you go back 200 years, the slang that Jonathan Swift wrote about in a big book called on English Conversation, none of it is used today. But at the time was so popular. I mean, slang varies like that. And it's, other point, it's only about 1% of the vocabulary of the language. All these little expressions that we're talking about. All the things about text messaging abbreviations we were talking about earlier. 1% of the language. English has how many words? Answer, nobody knows. But at least 1 million, probably twice as many. When you think of World English. In the Oxford English Dictionary, there are 750,000 words. In the Webster Dictionary in America, there are 750,000 words, but they're not the same words. American English, British English. 1 million at least. 1%, few thousand new words coming in, new bits of slang here and there. Not a big deal.
Yes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Crystal. I think this is my second experience of your lecture. I'm sure you gave us a lecture to U3A back in the 80s, but I can't remember where.
I did indeed, and you came back. Wow, that's really... Thank you very much. Yes, I remember the U3A.
Yeah. Would you agree that when people have an urge to communicate, they overcome language? I have 2 examples of this in my life. We used to go camping in France when the boys were young, and when we stopped, the boys would disappear down to the playground or the swimming pool, and these campsites were very international affairs in those days. There were French, German, Dutch, all sorts of languages there, but the children all played together and overcame this. And I can remember my younger son coming up to me and saying, Jean-Pierre wants to come out with us tomorrow. And I thought, oh God, you know, my French is a little bit rusty. I've got to go and negotiate with his parents. But the children managed to translate for us, even though at that age, my younger son had never had a French lesson. And the second example is much later, in the late 80s, 90s, when Gorbachev opened up Russia, the town of Watford was twinned with Novgorod. And to this end, some of us attempted to learn Russian to entertain the visitors from Russia. And I was quickly given some pen friends who invited me over there. I was one of the first people in Watford to go and stay with a Russian family. And I expected them to treat me like the deaf old aunt. But rather than that, they spoke Russian and French and Hungarian. I had French and a smattering of Russian. But we sat round the kitchen table every night, and they didn't speak about, you know, what they had and the cost of living. We were speaking about art and literature and all sorts of wonderful things, well beyond my language capability. But we managed with different languages.
You managed, yeah.
We managed, and with drawings and a lot of humour. So you can communication can overcome language if there's a desire for it.
No, you're quite right. To a certain degree, of course. If the conversation started to get at all serious, then you know everybody would be out of their depth. But at a certain level of basic communication, really, what you say is absolutely normal, happens all over the world. And sometimes that interaction becomes so regular, so routine, because the people don't just meet up for an evening or so here and there, they're meeting each other all the time because they're trading with each other, for example. And because, you know, they go to that part of the world and trade and back again, a new language evolves. It's called a pidgin language, P-I-D-G-I-N, a pidgin language. A pidgin language is sometimes called a contact language. And it's a language which shares bits and pieces of the two languages, or might sometimes more, that everybody is using in that particular situation. And after a while, it develops its own vocabulary, a few thousand words. It's all you need, though, to do this trading, you see. You're not going to talk about politics or anything. You're just going to need a trading language. And there are thousands of pidgin languages around the world in various shapes. Not so much around here, but in Africa, West Africa, for example, there are hundreds. In Southeast Asia, hundreds, and so on and so forth. And then the magic happens. Some of the people who use a pidgin language use it so often it becomes like a mother tongue. And they start to say, well, why can't we have the Bible translated into pidgin? So they do. Why can't we have a newspaper in pidgin? So they produce one. There's one over in the Southeast Asia called One Talk, newspaper, published every week in pidgin. And then the second piece of magic happens. Well, this is such a useful language, I'm going to have my children learn it. And so kids grow up learning the pidgin English as a mother tongue and then expand it themselves using the slang and things that we were talking about before and all the rest of it. And when that happens, a pidgin evolves into what is called a Creole language. And Creole languages, of course, are all over the place. Lots of people from southern states of United States, for example, Black Americans and so on, speaking Jamaica Creole. And they're huge, these Creole languages. I've got a book at home, a dictionary of the Creole language of Trinidad and Tobago, tiny little isles. It's that thick. It's got 15,000 words and phrases and slang expressions in it, just used in Trinidad and Tobago in that Creole area. So they have really developed into quite significant languages.
Yeah.
Thanks for the talk. Pidgin is an official language of New Guinea, isn't it?
It is indeed. And One Talk is the newspaper there.
What I was going to say was, I was interested in the serious use of languages. I talked to somebody the other day and saying how unbelievably difficult it would be if we didn't have an English language or a one language for air traffic control, for instance. And we happen to have picked English, so it's great for the English. But when I was studying chemistry, I was in the 60s, I was encouraged to learn German, because in those days, the Germans were the greatest chemists of the 18th and 19th centuries, so there's a hell of a lot in German. But if you think about it, I was reading something of Isaac Newton recently, it was all in Latin. And so the science was, in Newton's time, it was Latin. Of course, that was probably based on the fact that the Catholic Church dominated religion with Latin script and so on. But
it's the language of education.
Yeah, and when I was working in South America, the kids I came into contact with, they spoke three languages: Spanish, English, and Portuguese. And I said, "Why?" I was listening to them, and they were switching between languages. And they said, "Well, we speak English for major business. We speak Portuguese for local business, because there's a lot of Portuguese influence in Buenos Aires. And we speak Spanish for affairs of the heart. We chat the girls up in Spanish." So that was a useful tip, because I was only a young man in those days. So I'm just making the point that language is not just about your identity, like Welsh or English or Cornish or whatever. There's some very serious issues dependent on the language. I mean, I always feel for the Chinese, because they don't even have the same, they don't use an alphabet like ours and so on, you know.
Okay.
Yeah. You want to stop soon? Just a quick answer? Or,
You definitely, I'm just getting the microphone ahead of time. So go for it. Go for it.
Oh, good. Not sure what you want to. The one thing you should never do is try to predict the future when it comes to language. I mean, 1,000 years ago, if you had said to the intellectual authorities, scholars and so on, in 1,000 years' time, nobody will know Latin, apart from a few obvious groups here and there, they'd have laughed at you, they'd put you in, said, don't be ridiculous. 400 years ago, French will not long be the international language. What? Of course it will. English will always be an international language? Nah, not necessarily. A language becomes an international language or a global language for one reason only, and that is the power of the people who speak it. In the case of English, it just happens to be the case that colonialism and military activity started the global spread. By the end of the 17th century, people would say English was a language on which the sun never sets. Second reason, scientific power. The language of the Industrial Revolution was predominantly English. Most of the inventions that we all know, textiles, road macadam and all that sort of thing, were developed through the medium of the English language. So if you wanted to borrow that technology, you had to learn English. And still today, 80% of all the scientific journals in the world are in English. Third power, economic power, 19th century now. Money talks. Which language was it talking? At the beginning of the 19th century, English was the workshop of the world, people said. By the end of the 19th century, it was American English. In the middle of the 19th century, German was, of course, very important as a, as a money operation, as well as the science side that you mentioned. But the First World War changed all that. And so it left English for the 20th century for the fourth kind of power, namely cultural power. And here's a generalization you might think, no, it can't be true. Every cultural innovation of significance in the 20th century began either in the medium of English or was immediately facilitated by the medium of English. So you mentioned air traffic control. It's a very good example. The same point is for maritime control, sea speak as they call it, as opposed to air speak. The advertising world began in the medium of English. The internet began in the medium of English. And we can go on and on. Cinema, cinéma, that began in France. But where was it within 20 years? In Hollywood. And now something like 90% of the films in the world are still being made through the medium of English. So English as so four kinds of power: colonial, military, industrial, invention, scientific, technological, money, economic, and culture. Those four reasons together have produced English as a global language. But will that continue? All depends, doesn't it? You can easily imagine a scenario where some other culture in the world becomes more powerful than any other culture, and it suddenly becomes de rigueur, to use an English expression, to learn what? Chinese in one scenario, Arabic in another scenario. Spanish is the fastest growing language in the world at the moment, has been for some time. If South America and Central America suddenly become the powerhouses, we'll all have to start learning Spanish and Portuguese. And English could. No language has ever lasted for long. Go back to the Bible. All the languages of the Bible, Assyrian, Babylonian, all gone. Everyone. Only Hebrew left. And that was a success story of the kind I mentioned earlier on. It is the only one. So, future, who knows?
I'm going to take just one more, and if anyone else has got questions, perhaps we could do them afterwards, because we're running out of time.
Well, I hesitate to speak after such an erudite and entertaining lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
But I wanted to make or emphasize the point that language exists to enable communication. And I learned this some years ago when the dean of the school in Peking asked me to go to a Chinese conference. And I said, there's no point. I don't speak Chinese. He said, don't worry. The working language is English.
Yeah.
And on a more amusing situation at another conference where we had something like 40 interpreters for varying languages, I was very friendly with the Spanish representative, and he spoke better English than I did. I mean, he was very, very good with his English. But he lived, I think, in the Canary Islands. And when he was called upon to speak as the main speaker, he decided that he had to speak in Spanish as the Spanish representative. A few minutes later, there was a deputation from the translators saying to him, could he please change, please, and speak in English? They couldn't translate his Spanish,
No.
but they could very, very well understand his English. So I emphasize the point that a common language, when you come to science and probably politics as well, is a very essential thing to avoid misunderstandings as best one can.
Yeah.
Joyce and I think, have been married 73 years. We speak the same language. We still sometimes misunderstand one another. So I appreciate the same language has limitations. Thank you.
But no civil war.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And indeed, and indeed, I could have added that although you can never guarantee the future, there are no signs at the moment of English not staying global for the foreseeable future, for the reasons that you mentioned. Yes, the Chinese, once upon a time, waved a little red book of the sayings of Mao Zedong in Chinese. Now they wave a little red book, which is the BBC series on English. That is still, English is still the fastest growing language in China and seems to continue to be the case, especially on the radio. I know the lady who used to do Katie Flower, English by radio over there, tremendously successful. And it's the same everywhere. The statistics are clear. In 1990, the number of people who spoke English in the world globally was something like 1.5 billion, 1,500 million. By 2003, 4, that figure had grown to 2 billion. When a survey was done in 2018, 2019, that figure had grown to 2.3 billion. So the language is still growing, but you'll notice slightly less fast than in the previous decade. So it may be flattening out a little bit, but it is still the fastest growing language, apart from Spanish, in the world. And at an international level, it has no competitor at all. So, yeah, we're all safe with English for the foreseeable future, it seems to me.
Thank you very much indeed for an excellent talk this evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And your books will immediately go on sale.
Well, it's my pleasure. Yes, you asked me to bring some books, and I've done so.
Yes.
The language death one relates to the subject of the talk. The other is just a sort of random selection for what we're calling Black Thursday.
Okay.
If you're interested, I'd be happy to sign them, of course. And if you, Christmas present time, if you want me to sign them to somebody, happy to do that. And if there's a book there that you can't get and you'd still like it from me, just get in touch and we'll arrange it by post. Thank you very much.
Thank you.